Good afternoon, everybody. I'm having some trouble with the technology and it may fall off my head in mid-presentation. Please pretend nothing has happened. My name is Isilda Malley. I've been invited to chair this session and I want to thank the organisers, in particular Donal and Laura, for the amazing work that has gone into producing such a magnificent conference. I'm a great believer in historians and lawyers educating each other. It seems to me that far too often the lawyers do not understand why a particular legal measure or decision was particularly significant at a given time. And meanwhile, the historians don't always appreciate the necessity to take account of the significance of legal developments. The anniversary that we're marking is clearly one of the most important in the history of this state. It's one that for many of us will bring back family memories of ancient quarrels and divisions. But for some families, it's still a matter that affects the present day. This time in 1922, there were many events that are being marked by the historians and to some extent by the lawyers over the decade of centenaries. The centenaries are crowding in thick and fast at this stage. This week we'll see the anniversary of the execution of Rory O'Connor. At one time, the best friend of my grandfather, Kevin O'Higgins, he was shot without trial on the orders of a government that included Kevin O'Higgins. In the meantime, my mother's family, the Ryans of Tom Cool, were deeply split over the treaty and the subsequent events. My father's uncle Jim Ryan and his aunt Nell Ryan were in prison on the orders of their brother-in-law, Dick Mulcahy. That family split took years to overcome, and I have heard it said that my own parents' wedding in 1952 was the first event at which the Ryan family actually all relaxed together. And I'm not sure that it is not too soon to say that the Civil War divisions have healed entirely in political terms either. But nonetheless, we mark it and we learn about it and we resolve to confront our history and to deal with wherever it may bring us, combined with our own choices. The next session is a fascinating one. It looks at the wider context of the 1922 Constitution. If you just bear with me 1 second now, and I'll just give you a little bit of information about the speakers. The first speaker on the program is Professor Colin Murray, who is I'm sorry, it's the combination of the earpiece and the glasses that I can't actually see properly. Okay, I'll just hold it like this.
Yeah, there's one, or just talking to that one there is fine. Yeah.
There's a microphone in front of me. Who knew? Right. Professor Colin Murray is the Professor of Law and Democracy at Newcastle Law School. I'm told that his research has been cited in UK Supreme Court judgments. It is clearly simply a matter of time before he makes his way into an Irish Supreme Court judgment. Most recently, he has been working on the impact of Brexit on governance and identity in Northern Ireland in a project called Performing Identities. And he is going to, in his presentation, address one of the most significant absences from the 1922 Constitution, any reference to partition and to Northern Ireland. So, Colin, thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much to everyone for coming along today, and particular to Laura and Donal for putting together today's event. Yes, I want to talk to you about something that doesn't exist. I'm going to spend my time talking about the absence of any discussion of partition from the 1922 Constitution. And the reason for that is very simple. Partition in terms of the constitutional order both has and has not happened yet. Article 12 of the treaty sees the Ulster month begin, but the Ulster month the period of time in which Northern Ireland's Parliament can reject being part of the Irish Free State, only starts to run when the final bit of the treaty is ratified, and final treaty ratification only happens today, 100 years ago, the 5th of December, along with the Westminster Parliament accepting the Irish Free State's new constitution. That is the trigger point for the Ulster Month happening. So how could the new constitution in any way reference partition? It's built on an assumption that this might not happen, even though everyone knows this will inevitably happen. So what I'm going to talk about this afternoon is the here's what you could have won prize. Here's the Irish Free State's constitutional order against the Government of Ireland Act 1920, and how two new political orders and constitutional orders in Ireland were set up in opposition to each other and interacted poorly with each other during their lifetimes. So what I'm going to look at is, if you like, what's left out or what's marginal in the text of the 1922 Constitution. If you want references to geographical boundaries and the territory of the state, you can find it there in Article 3. Every person domiciled in the area of the jurisdiction of the Free State at the time of coming into operation of the Constitution. Really quite strangulated set of words, but one that's going to have significance, as I'm going to raise later. And then Article 74, there in the transitory provisions of the Constitution. We are keeping customs duties and taxes as they are up to the 1st of April 1923, the beginning of a new tax year. So if you manage to avoid finance and taxes with David Kenny, oh boy, you're going to get it with me. So what we've got is a slow motion putting together of what a new state involves. And it doesn't all unfold at one time. And as we've just heard, this is why the decade of centenaries feels like it's almost interminable. And I bet there will be no fireworks going off to celebrate a new customs boundary being put in place in the island of Ireland on the 1st of April 1923. But what you do have is two rival governance orders. One of those governance orders is under the 4th Home Rule Bill, the Government of Ireland Act 1920, and the other is under the Irish Free State's Constitution. Now, the important thing is that a level, well, of nothing short of chauvinism accompanied the passing of this legislation at Westminster amongst particularly prominent Ulster Unionists. So here is the Duke of Abercorn, who's been involved in various unionist assemblies over the previous decade, being absolutely clear on what this new division will mean. Maybe the upright constitutional order of Northern Ireland will teach them a lesson in Dublin, and by the strict example of following what Northern Ireland is doing, some idea of constitutional rectitude will be able to be transferred to the Irish Free State. Now, that sort of language is throughout the debates that were happening from 1920, when the Government of Ireland Bill is before Parliament, right up to the passing of the Irish Free State Constitution Act in December of 1922. Carson probably would have absolutely disagreed with Thomas More's interpretation of unionists, and particularly those linked to Ulster unionism, weren't concerned with the new constitution, because he castigated this bill as it came through Parliament. He said this is the damnosa inheritas of Lloyd George that he has imposed on Bonar Law's new government. He left us this steaming mess, and you now have to enact the legislation that makes it happen. And it is why the bill is rushed through Parliament in the last days of November and early December 1922, because we're just after the 1922 general election. But before that, we already have partition in place. Northern Ireland famously celebrated its centenary last year. In the summer of last year, with the Government of Ireland Act 1920 coming into effect. And of course, this creates two polities on a Home Rule model. Now, the Government of Ireland Act is an incredibly restrictive set of constitutional provisions. If you look at provisions like Section 4, subsection 7, gives absolutely no say over customs and trade to the new Home Rule parliaments. It is incredibly limited in terms of the tax-raising powers of these new parliaments. They are, almost in every regard, controlled and constrained from Westminster. And that direct control is very much what the UK government wants in this setup. Now, Southern Ireland, what Hugh Kennedy came to call this freak that he was going to expunge in the creation of the Irish Free State Constitution, is seen as being overwritten by that new constitutional order. So instead we get a twin-track approach. Two constitutional orders on a completely different setup is how we're often asked to think about the arrangements in the early 1920s. And the important thing is, for Northern Ireland, all of those constraints that existed under the Government Act of 1920 remain in full effect. The things that effectively prevent this governance order ever being able to fulfill whatever potential it might have had. Patrick Buckland, in the Factory of Grievances in the late 1970s, went through all of the limitations to fiscal powers, to tax-raising powers, to customs powers that the new Northern Ireland institutions faced, and concluded, even in the best angels of their nature, they could never have made a success of this order, especially facing into the headwinds of industrial decline that would affect Northern Ireland's heavy industries and linen industry into the late 1920s and 1930s. But what did the Irish Free State Constitution give? Well, if you like, what was being talked about in that last session, the core of that Constitution was one that gave a huge measure of independence. Carson stood up, and in language that, well, let's face it, no senior judge in Parliament should have been using, but should you have had senior judges in Parliament, we'll put that over to one side, was saying the British government should just admit it was defeated. Why are you hiding any of this? This is a constitution for victors in a new governance order that has been won for itself at the start of December 1920. And in the language of the jurisprudence of dominions that would emerge in the 20s and 30s, therefore, Ireland was able to become mistress in her own house. Now that gendered language and that personification of states is something that Professor O'Donoghue has written an awful lot about, and it really gets you to this idea of, oh, it's nearly a state. And it's very much meant to be thought about in that way at this time. But that's inherent in the freedom to achieve freedom narrative of the treaty and the 1922 constitutional order. It is completely different in terms of its level of constraint than what was facing the Northern Ireland administration at the time. And that mattered. The height of violence in 1921, just before the truce, the UK government and the military put in place a plan to close all borders, including the new border between Southern Ireland under the Government of Ireland Act and Northern Ireland. It had a range of powers under the Restoration of Order in Ireland Act to do that. A year later, the truce is in place, but the Belfast pogroms are still ongoing, and a huge amount of violence continues to grip the north. Well, the Unionist administration seeks to try to close the border in the same way. And the papers, particularly from the Home Affairs Office, say, we're going to use those powers, that plan that we know was in place for last summer, that was going to come into effect the second the truce broke down. Until the Attorney General puts a side message aside and said, you know the Government of Ireland Act 1920, as soon as you try to close a border, that's going to affect trade. And you don't have the ability to do it in any way. Sorry, this doesn't pass go. So the Unionists learned very quickly that what they had puffed up and celebrated as this is going to be our chance to show what good governance is to the island didn't really amount to a hill of beans. And at the same time, they knew that the Irish government was getting ready to bring in place customs borders. They knew that Article 74 of the Constitution was not going to remain in place for long and that something new was coming. Immediately, in December 1922, on the new state being created, there were leaks to Craig's government in the north of material being put together by the Northeast Boundary Bureau at 16 Kildare Street, so just down the road, asking the Great Northern Railway of Ireland for full schedules of all the goods passing every station in Ireland for dutiable purposes. They knew that customs borders and boundaries were going to be put in place to protect Ireland's industry. And this was going to affect, especially in the aftermath of the Belfast boycott, northern industries that had traditionally supplied into Ireland. You fast forward a couple of years, and Cork becomes a huge concern for Northern Ireland customs agents and the UK government in general, because Cork Customs is sending back anything that's marked Irish manufacture or made in Ireland that they know to be a Northern Ireland good. They're using the full panoply of new customs powers that Ireland has as a state to constrain and what's going on in Northern Ireland and to continue with a form of the boycott. Now, ultimately, there's a lot of complaints in Northern Ireland government text about this. They're ultimately told there's very little we can do. They have the powers of a dominion. They can regulate trade. And that is Arthur Griffith's most important win in the constitutional settlement. He never let up on the focus on trade and customs as being a driver to protecting industries. Then beyond that, we have a series of, now sideways for some reason, images, but nonetheless, of activities at the time of the first week of December 1922 as to what is the address going to look like for Northern Ireland to secede. And there are two different drafts that goes round. You won't be able to see it particularly well here, but one says that the powers of the Irish Free State will not apply to Northern Ireland. The other says that they will no longer apply to Northern Ireland. And it's that latter draft that actually takes effect, that is accepted. Why? Because of the Council of Ireland and those provisions in the 1920 Act. Unionist politicians are really afraid that the government in Dublin is going to be able to use the 1920 Act's powers to control Northern Ireland's railways and to completely control its fisheries and its waterways. All of the Council of Ireland provisions are going to have a powerful bite on it. Now, fast forward a decade, and because of the form of words that's adopted there, you get a case like Inraid Logue, where the courts in Ireland are able to say, well, the territory of the state did once include Northern Ireland. Look, you said these powers no longer apply. That definitional difference allowed citizenship to be extended over anyone born at anywhere in Ireland, not simply in Northern Ireland. Now, to finish up, do I have an awful lot of sympathy for the Unionist government in Belfast for the predicament that they found themselves in the 20s and 30s? No, because if you go through all of the cabinet documents, the minutes of cabinet meetings directing the Government of Ireland bill, who's present in those meetings? Lieutenant Colonel Sir James Craig MP. He knows what he's signing up to. He just believes that people in Belfast are going to work this better, despite all the constraints that he knows exist in it. And that ultimately becomes the act of hubris which, well, in many ways dooms aspects of the constitutional project in Northern Ireland. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Colin. Now, the next speaker is Dr. Niamh Howlin, and Niamh is an associate professor in the Sutherland School of Law in UCD. She appears to have developed a remarkable speciality in 19th century miscarriages of justice and righting the wrongs of events that happened over a century ago, and therefore clearly is living in the moment of 1922. The theme of her presentation today is the Irish Bar and its contribution to public life and the development of the Irish Free State. Thanks, Steve.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm just going to get back to the first slide. So in this short paper, I'm looking at the unique contribution made by members of the Irish Bar to the drafting of the 1922 Constitution. And this is part of the wider contribution made by barristers to the establishment of the Free State. So I want to look at who these barristers were, how they contributed to the drafting, and the significance of their involvement. So first of all, who were they? Well, various members of the drafting committee have been mentioned at different points today, so I'm not going to go through them all. In the words of Tom Moore, there was no shortage of legal and administrative talent on the committee. So first of all, I want to note that 2 members of the committee's secretariat were also qualified as barristers. So first of all, we had Edward Ned Millington Stevens, whose grandson spoke to us on the video just before this session. He was 34 years old. He had qualified from Trinity College. He was called to the bar a decade previous to this, in 1912. He had accompanied Collins as a legal draftsman during the treaty negotiations in London, and then at Collins's behest, he was seconded from his civil service post to serve the Constitution Committee. The other barrister civil servant was 39-year-old Patrick Albert O'Toole from Cabra. O'Toole had degrees from the National University of Ireland, and he had been called to the bar in 1913. Now, apart from the joint secretaries, 4 of the other full members of the committee were barristers. So these were Hugh Kennedy, John O'Byrne, Kevin O'Sheil, and James Murnaghan. A 5th lawyer on the committee was, of course, Clemens J. France, who was a US attorney, who was a Presbyterian and a Labour lawyer. So let's take a closer look at the barristers on the committee. So first of all, John O'Byrne. John O'Byrne was 38 years old. He had originally worked as a civil servant in London and then in the Irish Land Commission. He had been called to the Irish Bar in 1911 and practiced on the very large Leinster Circuit. One of his contemporaries at the bar was Eugene Sheehy, who wrote that in those early decades of the century, there was an abundance of talent on the Leinster Circuit, but practically no work. He said, the circuit then contained within its ranks many men who attained high office and judicial rank, others who won high eminence at the Irish Bar, and still more who achieved fame in public life, art, and literature. You can guess, therefore, what a scrimmage it was for the few briefs in circulation. So I'm sure any practicing or former barristers who are here can probably empathise with that. And O'Byrne was surely one of those to whom Sheehy was referring as a talented member of the bar. In 1921, O'Byrne had served as a legal advisor to the Dáil delegation in the treaty negotiations, and he was generally known to be a pretty safe pair of hands. Next, we had James Augustine Murnaghan, who was 41 years old. He'd been born in the United States and then grew up in County Tyrone, where his father was an MP for the Irish Party. He studied at UCD and was called to the Irish Bar in 1903. He practiced on the northern and the hard-living, hard-drinking Midland Circuit. Make of that what you will. Murnaghan was appointed as a part-time professor of law in UCD in 1908, but he kept up his practice at the bar as a junior counsel on more or less a part-time basis. The Irish Independent described him in January 1922 as having a reputation as a constitutional lawyer, and Hugh Geoghegan characterises him as primarily an academic with a practice that was solid but modest. Kevin Rowntree O'Shiel was a few years younger than the others at 31. Like Bernahan, he was from County Tyrone. He went to school in England and then attended Trinity College, and his friends would have been English, Irish, Catholic, Protestant, nationalists, and unionists. He was called to the bar in 1913, the same year as O'Toole, and he was also quite good friends with Ned Stevens. He practiced on the Northwestern Circuit, which was generally considered to be a very diverse circuit when it came to religion and politics. During World War I, he started to combine his work at the bar with political journalism, and he published The Birth of a Republic in 1920, which Tom Garvin describes as a competent popular history for Irish readers of the birth of the American Republic. In 1920, he advised Arthur Griffith about setting up the Dáil Land Courts, and he served as Judicial Commissioner from 1920 to 1922, famously disguising himself as a travelling salesman while going around the country to hear the cases. By 1922, he had a very solid reputation and was appointed Assistant Legal Advisor to the Provisional Government. And finally, of course, Hugh Kennedy, the most senior of the barristers. He had a BA and an LLB from the Royal University of Ireland. He had been called to the bar in 1902 and was called to the inner bar in 1920. He practiced on the Munster Circuit, and he was both the most senior and the oldest of the barristers on the committee at the age of 43. He had a very strong reputation as a lawyer and was known by some acquaintances as the Brehon. He'd been the legal advisor to the Department of Local Government under the First Dáil and the senior legal advisor during the treaty negotiations. When the Irish Independent was reporting on the membership of this drafting committee, it described Kennedy as a sound and careful practitioner. So those, very briefly, were the 6 barristers who assisted on the drafting committee for the 1922 Constitution. So how did they contribute to this document that we're celebrating today? As David Kenny says, they had 6 weeks and quite a lot of work to do. So they began their work on the 24th of January, 1922, and the drafting stage, as we know, was completed by the 7th of March. And in that time, they consulted quite a number of documents, constitutions from European and other Commonwealth countries, and many of these had to be translated from various languages. Obviously, while Collins was nominally the chair of the committee, we know that in practice it was Darrell Figgis who chaired most of the meetings. David Farrell commented on the thoroughness of the committee's work and its capacity to reach agreed recommendations quickly. I think that may be a slightly overly optimistic view of the way the committee worked, but they got the job done in the end. And there does seem to have been broad agreement on most of the major issues that they considered. Figgis, Douglas and Kennedy would really be the most influential members of the committee. O'Rahilly was also very productive, but his opinions were often a bit uncompromising for the other members. Of the barristers, Murnaghan and O'Shiel probably contributed the least for different reasons. So Murnaghan fell ill in February and he wasn't able to attend many of the meetings that took place after that. Ronan Keane has written in the Dictionary of Irish Biography that Murnaghan contributed significantly to the work of the Constitution Committee, but both Farrell and Laura Cahalan are of the view that he didn't really have much influence beyond the judicial provisions, which he worked on with John O'Byrne. O'Byrne was said to be a regular attender at the meetings, but there's really not that much evidence of his influence on the drafts. Kevin O'Shiel, who had joined the committee late, was, as mentioned, also the assistant legal advisor to the Provisional Government. So consequently, there were quite a lot of demands on his time, and he missed quite a few of the meetings. Unsurprisingly, Hugh Kennedy was really the biggest contributor amongst the lawyers. In the preliminary drafting, in the general discussion, and in the final legal phrasing of the Constitution's provisions, his energy and his work ethic are quite well known. Now, I know the Attorney General earlier this morning mentioned Kennedy's frequent absences from committee meetings, but having taken a look at his diary entries for this period, it's quite exhausting even just to read everything that he was getting up to. So his notebooks have logged, just the amount of sheer hours that were clocked up by the drafting committee. And I would estimate that in the month of February 1922, Kennedy was putting in about 40 hours a week on this committee, and that was on top of all of the other responsibilities that he had and all his other engagements, and all the reading that had to take place in between meetings. So he wasn't just clocking up the hours, he was engaging very actively with all of the foreign constitutions and really getting stuck into the debates. One of his contemporaries, Con Curran, said that in Kennedy's constitution-making days, he was deeply conversant with the work of American jurists and the drafters of the US Constitution. He was also very careful regarding the precise language and phrasing used in the draft Constitution. And according to Tom Garvin, he was trying to placate the anti-treaty Republicans by the use of what he describes as legal formulas that resembled the Jesuitical formulas of Catholic canon law. I'm not sure how successful that was. Now, aside from contributing to the drafting and the text of the Constitution, was there any other value to having barristers on the committee? Well, I would say that the work of the committee really seems to have exemplified a very collaborative approach between people from different traditions and slightly different backgrounds. And I've already mentioned that Farrell talks about how they got over various disagreements at different points in the work of the committee. The Irish Examiner commented in 1931 that the law library, where barristers worked, was always the one place in a divided country where political opponents met on terms of comradeship. And in my study of the profession across a sort of a 70-year period, this kind of rhetoric really is pervasive. To give another example, John Kelly, a barrister as well as, of course, being a politician and an academic, remarked in the Dáil in the mid-20th century that at the bar there was a sort of brotherhood which completely transcended political links and in particular completely transcends religious differences. So, true or not, there certainly was this impression that members of the bar were used to working alongside and collaboratively with people from other traditions, other religions, and other beliefs. So possibly this ability to work constructively with people from fairly diverse backgrounds could be seen as a way in which a preponderance of barristers on the committee manifested itself. Picture of the four courts. A second thing to consider is whether the presence of so many lawyers or barristers on the committee added an air of legitimacy. So one could maybe argue that the bar was overrepresented on the Constitution Committee. It's surprising, for example, that there's no representative from the other branch of the legal profession. But be that as it may, a high representation of lawyers among elected representatives, for example, had been evident for much of the 19th century. And it was common to other common law countries in the 20th century. A writer on the Canadian legal profession, Mela Le Brunet, noted, and I quote, "Between 1920 and 1960, discourses and activities in law schools clearly promoted this link between the legal profession and politics. As a profession of service, legal practice was thought naturally to lead to public office, and public office often went hand in hand with nation building, especially in the earlier decades of the 20th century." Another example of this beyond Ireland would be post-independence Finland, for example, where, according to one legal historian, a legal education was, for a long time, the most important qualification for higher posts in political life. Now, in his opening remarks this morning, the Attorney General echoed the point that has been made by Tom Garvin that the new politicians in the Free State were, by and large, veterans of guerrilla warfare, which weakened their claim to political legitimacy. Law offered them a way out, in the words of Garvin, a psychological defense against the ideological arguments of the anti-treatyites. And law could, of course, only be supplied by lawyers. And he says that this accounts for the rapid post-treaty political ascent of people like Hugh Kennedy and Kevin O'Shiel. So this could be considered a second benefit of having barristers on the drafting committee. They conferred this air of legitimacy, of law and order, of the rule of law during a very troubled period. A third and a final way that we could look at the contribution of barristers on this committee is in relation to their ability to synthesize information. So remember, none of the people on the committee had ever drafted a constitution before. They had a huge amount of work to do in a short period of time. They had to consider huge volumes of information and documentation over this short time period, which was characteristic of the way that barristers worked. Leo Cohn later wrote about their diligent search of foreign constitutions, and Swift McNeill wrote about their use of other constitutions as models. Some of these were quite lengthy, and procuring them wasn't always straightforward. So, some brief conclusions. The 1922 Constitution had to appeal to and appease several interested parties. As Kennedy himself later wrote, the committee was small but included men of diverse training, administrative, commercial, legal, academic, and political. In the 20th century, Harkness criticised their relative inexperience, but I think Tom Moore characterised this as quite unkind, because previous experience is rarely a qualification available for people drafting constitutions for new states. And in fact, the job of the 1937 Constitution, as we know, was made considerably easier by the work done by this committee. So in the absence of people with prior experience, populating the committee with members of the bar seems to have brought several advantages in terms of the substance of the document and its perceived legitimacy. And this forms part of the long tradition of members of the bar playing significant roles in public life throughout the turbulent 1920s and the rest of the century, as elected representatives, civil servants, as superintendents of the Garda Síochána, as court officials, civil servants, TDs, and senators on all parts of the political spectrum. So we see how the experiences, viewpoints, and priorities of one profession could have a significant and lasting impact on Irish public life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Niamh. Now, the final speaker in this session is Professor Aoife O'Donoghue from Queen's University in Belfast. Professor O'Donoghue is a specialist in international governance. She takes a particular interest in feminism and in tyranny, utopia, Brexit, and Northern Ireland. I think that probably just about takes in everything. The presentation that she's giving today is concerned with a feminist reinterpretation of the events of 1922, what the Constitution could have been like, and I think the unfulfilled promise that had been made since 1916 that the new Ireland would be a place of equality for women, that didn't quite come to pass, not in 1922 at least. So hopefully we will have some time then for some questions and answers at the conclusion of Aoife's paper. Thanks, Aoife.
Thank you to both Donal and Laura. I was lucky enough when I got this invitation to also receive this booklet that's in the presentation, and I recommend it all to you. It's from the poet Julie Morrissey, who is the poet in residence at the National Library of Ireland, and she actually is a law graduate, and she has a wonderful poem about the 1937 Constitution called Constitution Gendered Male. But this work is on the women of the years leading up to the 22 Constitution, and it's where I got the title, I Am Lonely for Them. It's a poem she wrote in dedication to Annie O'Farrelly. And in many ways it encapsulates my feelings towards these amazing women who, in work I'm currently doing on feminist constitutional futures for the island, for Ireland and Northern Ireland, whatever the Westphalian outcome of that might be, but also previous work I've done on feminist judging on the island. And in that, looking at the extraordinary work that those women did, and the sheer number of those women, and the dreams that they had of the Ireland they thought they were fighting for, that they were working towards, that they were contributing to. And crosses this great phrase about constitutions guiding a nation towards its dreams. But as many women know, and as many women on this island have experienced, it can always also lead you to your nightmares. And I think that is possibly what makes me sad for those women, or lonely for the Ireland that they thought they were getting, or they thought they were working towards, which perhaps I now inhabit, but I'm perhaps lonely that they aren't there to celebrate, or didn't get to have the experience or hope that they wanted. So I'm not going to go through all these amazing women. There's, what's extraordinary, as Foster has written, it took the state well over 40 years to get back to the position with regard to the law on women that we'd been in. If we talk about Ireland as part of the UK, the first barristers were from Ireland who were female, the first female solicitors, the first women to hold public office were women. You had women writing, obviously women who were politicians, who were elected politicians, who were part of local councils, corporations, obviously more famously elected, but also, who were actively writing textbooks, like somebody like Sophie Bryant writing books about the Brehon Law. These were actively engaged in law, in legal thinking, were part of the public realm, were engaged in creating a legal community that then, and I think we all need to reflect on this, a legal community that then left them all behind, including all the people that we've been speaking about today. And one of the reasons I want to say that is, so the second picture is Frances Moran, who was the first chair in law in Ireland or the UK in the 1950s. But when she died, the Dulge published an obituary, and it's actually quite a sad document to read, because it undermines every single one of her achievements. Every single one is laughed at. Her voice is laughed at. She wasn't a very good barrister. She wasn't a very good teacher. I mean, the idea that the woman was anything at all is kind of made fun of. In contrast, you have women like Mary Macken, who was a professor in German, who became a professor in 1910. And in the 1950s, a very beautiful piece of work is written about her on her retirement and all her achievements, her knowledge of Goethe. So it wasn't that it was normal for women with incredible professional achievements to be ignored. It was, UCD were capable of writing something beautiful but about woman professor in 1950. But even in the 1980s, law and lawyers and collectively as a community, we were leaving the women in the profession down. So I want to go back and talk about what the aspirations of the women were. Now I want to start with the 1916 proclamation. And the proclamation is a form of manifesto. Now war manifestos were an important part of international law and the use of force prior to 1945. And Scott Shapiro and Una Hathaway have developed a database of these proclamations, of these war proclamations, and they include, in the database, there is the 1916 proclamation. And what's interesting about these kind of war proclamations as manifestos is that they both declare war, but they also constitute a new state. So they do both of those things at the same time, and that's very familiar in manifestos as precursors to constitutions. They make a claim to constituent power, which we've already talked about today. They take ownership of constituent power, and they say, we are now claiming this power to end the previous governance system to create the new. And that war manifestos do that. So is it possible to see the 1916 proclamation in a way as a feminist manifesto of its time? And I think it's important in that sense then to look at the context of what's going on at that point. Now, as I've already mentioned, women were already engaged in a multiplicity of legal fora at that point, from applying to be in the professions, getting law degrees, holding public office, etc. They were also involved, obviously the suffragette movement had been very active and involved and in changing who was in the public realm already. So the idea that women were claiming power and space as politically active constituents, it was already there. That was a live debate that was familiar, including people like Eva Gore Booth, who was a very prominent suffragette in Ireland and in the UK. and what would remain of the UK. You also have a sort of, in the proclamation, a sort of idea of, or the women saw as sort of an active role that they would play in it, that the proclamation doesn't have the equality provisions that it has simply because there were some progressive men, okay, which, I mean, Connolly and Pearce were with regard to women to a certain degree, especially Connolly, but because that text was influenced by the women who they were close to, who were talking to them. It was their expectation. So you have that, and you have what Foster refers to as the geography of rebelliousness. That was quite alive and active at the time, and that women were very much taking control of gender norms. So there's a quote there from Margaret Skinner about how, you know, she would change clothes. She would assume go out when she wanted the British forces to just think of her as a woman going about her private domestic business. She would dress one way and then she would come back and put on her uniform and carry on her active role as she saw herself as a soldier and as an active soldier. And that this was how she perceived herself. And what you see in the writings of the time and the women, the papers of the time, and a lot of historians have alluded to, is the importance of the 1916 proclamation because of that women's attachment to the proclamation was because it demonstrated to them their importance, their significance, the type of Ireland they thought that they were, in the words of Margaret Skinner, doing their bit for. That's what they were doing their bit for. They would be rewarded by having the Ireland that they were attempting to proclaim or claim. And of course, then if we think about what happened and what came about, now alongside my work on utopia, I also do a lot of work on tyranny. And with tyranny, I use a taxonomy, and there's quite different elements of that taxonomy. But I think quite a few of them are quite evident in the 1922 Constitution if we use a device developed by Naomi Alderman in a book called The Power. So I do quite a bit of own literature as well. And in her book, she changes one thing about society. So men no longer have physical prowess over women. That's all that changes. But over the course of the novel, men become subject to quite horrible things happen to them physically, emotionally over the end, and the world has changed utterly at the end. But importantly, nothing happens to the men that isn't happening to the women now. And a lot of the reviews the book called the book dystopian. But in order for that book to be dystopian, the world we live in now has to be dystopian, because there's nothing happening to the men that doesn't happen to women. And I think it's important to reflect on the 22 Constitution in that sense. So if men were removed from the public realm in the way that women were removed from the public realm, to the point that by the time you get to 1937, it can be explicitly said that their place is in the home, in the private sphere. So you are also in this period of time, women are being locked up in their thousands. We have the mother and baby home institutions, we have the laundries. Women are being detained, often against their will, for extended periods of time. As we've seen the reports that all of this was already in operation in this period and would only become more in operation in this period if men's ability to work in their chosen profession was removed. If they were removed from juries, you go from a position where women are active members of legal profession to a point where they're being removed from juries. If this had all been happening to men, we would call it a tyranny. Because it was happening to men in other parts of Europe, and that's what we refer to what was happening in other parts of Europe. But we don't see gendered tyranny when it happens to women in that sense. So I think it's important to think about the 1922 Constitution in that sense, and what happened to half the population, and what that meant for the livelihood of the state up to the present, up to now, where only very recently women have been able to recover bodily autonomy. And I think one of the, this very famous example, of course, of Nurse O'Farrell being removed from the photograph, of women's active space, active activities in the public sphere being actively removed from history. To again put it in this European context, a favorite act of Stalin, you got deleted from the photograph, though I can now do that on my phone, and I always feel slightly strange about erasing people from history. So what were the alternatives? Now, of course, we could start with the proclamation itself and the language. There was nothing, the British government did not have a problem with gender equality. This was not one of the issues they would have had, they could have vetoed. So there is language there in 1916 that they could have used. There's already referred to the programme for government earlier. And again, that language is restated in the programme for government. So again, it's not that it was unimagined. That idea of having equality is there, but also extends, what I think is interesting in the programme for government is reference to the poor laws. It is an acknowledgement of the way that people who are trapped in poverty are treated, and often those are the women who end up in those institutions. Not all. Middle-class women also ended up in these institutions, but more often than not, it was poor women, it was members of the traveller community who ended up in these places. And then, of course, we can also use their own language. So the very first quote there is from Constance Markovich in a speech where of 1909, and she's giving advice to women to go out, to be in the public sphere, to be active. Also, you have, and there's a number of quotes, but the last one there from Kathleen Clark is about hope and the darkness, the hope, and that hope is what a lot of the women had in 1922, that the hope that they might be able to get something, that this might be a passing darkness, and you get organizations like the Optimists set up by Hannah Sheehy Skeffington in the 20s and 30s to try to keep the hope alive that they could get back to what they had, that it was there, and they remained quite active in that sense. And I want to finish with just briefly talking about Dorothy McArdle's one of her short stories. A lot of her books have just been reissued in the last few years. But one of them is the portrait of Roisin Dhu, and in that she's specifically targeting the cultural appropriation of women and the turning of women into muse, and it's quite a prescient piece to have been written. And in 1923 and published in 24, she wrote it while she was in prison for being anti-treaty. And of course, a lot of the anti-treaty women at the time were blamed for the Civil War, which seems quite remarkable, but because they were overly emotional. And I would argue it's also possibly because they were attached to the 1916 proclamation because of what it had promised them. But in it, she says this idealization of women, that women became a muse. And in this story, it's supposed to be Yeats, but it's a poet or painter, paints this woman who represents Ireland and kills her in the process. But she comes back and haunts him, and he eventually dies from being haunted by this woman that he has killed. Because in the point that Dorothy McArdle was making was that the life of women in Ireland were being sucked out of them, and they were being created into this idea of this ideal muse, the kind of personification, the Lady Lavery on the notes, or indeed the locked away woman, which was the other woman who was present in Ireland at the time. And I wanted to finish with a great quote from where we are, from Margaret Skinner. That is 1916, rather than 1922. But also she had proposed bombing the Shelburne to get rid of the snipers on the roof. And then she wasn't allowed to take part in the actual operation because she was a woman. And she's saying about being disappointed. That's what made her unhappy. You know, she had a great idea and she wasn't allowed then to fulfill it. Because again, to go back to her biography and what she called it, doing her bit from Ireland. So with that, I would highly recommend the pamphlet. It's a beautiful collection of poems published last year by the National Library and available from them. And also some podcasts that Julie has done with it. To think about and to think of ourselves as lawyers and what it means and what we owe to those women, and particularly the female lawyers of that period of time. Thank you.
I think we'll take our cup of tea at this stage. Thank you.